So I came across this article and I want to share it with you because it really does highlight it really connects the dots for all of the regime change wars that we've experienced since 2000. And I mean, everything is as clear as day. I mean, it's absolutely clear what is going on, and it all comes down to the petrodollar. And we will get into the petrodollar and why it's so important and what would happen if it fully collapsed. I do want to get into that at a later time. Today, I don't want to, but I do want to start connecting some of these regime change war dots. And what's alarming is that when you look at all of the countries that have that we've made our enemy in some way, or we have gone in and overthrown in another way, they all have one really big thing in common. And that is that they decided that they were going to ditch using the American dollar to buy oil. So this great article from Market Slant, and I'm putting the link down below for you to read for yourself. But let's just go over some of the things that they have laid out for us here. So they talk about, back in the day, the dollar was backed by gold, an actual pile of gold that was stored in Fort Knox. And during Nixon's presidency, he decided to get rid of that and say, okay, we're not going to back the U.S. dollar anymore using actual physical gold. We're going to move to a different system. And that system was that now the dollar is basically propped up by, I would call it the oil market. So it's not backed by oil per se. It's not like every dollar is backed by a certain amount of oil. It's not that. It's the oil market that is propping up the dollar. So what happened was we actually struck a deal, and this is important to know. We struck a deal with Saudi Arabia that we would provide for them weapons and we would provide for them security, military security, in exchange for them to buy and sell, make sure that the buying and selling of oil was done in American dollars. Doing this made the dollar extremely strong, and it made the dollar in high demand. Everybody in the world who didn't have an oil reserve of their own would be required, which is the vast majority of the world, would be required to buy and sell oil using the American dollar, which means that these nations needed to get their hands on the American dollar. That made the dollar high demand. It made the dollar very, very valuable. Like I said, that's a whole different story that we're going to get into later of what happens if the dollar is devalued. I'm sure you can imagine, but that is a different topic for another day that I don't want to explore. Right now, I just want to get into connecting these regime change war dots. So, in essence, the deal was the U.S. would agree to military sales and defense of Saudi Arabia, it says here, in return for all oil trade being done in U.S. dollars. So, the relationship between oil and currency gives the dollar its value, and that is the essential thing to know. One by one, certain nations started to say, we don't like this deal. And we don't want to have to acquire American dollars, which cost maybe a lot out of our currency because they have to do an exchange. And maybe the exchange rate is really ridiculous for a particular nation. And it's causing them to spend a lot more on the oil than they normally would because they first have to take their currency, turn it into U.S. dollars, and then they can buy oil. And that can be very, very expensive for a nation. So especially if they're like, why can't I just buy the oil using my own currency? Why can't I buy oil using gold, gold-backed currency or whatever? So one by one, certain nations started to say, we don't really like this, and we're going to come up with a different solution. Now, some of these nations came up with the solution of using the Chinese yen. Some of them came up with the solution of creating their own currency that would be backed by actual gold again in order to buy and sell oil. Some of them, that was pretty much the two options there. I mean, I think some maybe have said that they would try to use the euro, and that would be maybe something that they could possibly do. Now, the nations, this is where we connect the dots. The nations that said, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do. These nations are, Iraq was the first. Then there was Iran and Libya and Venezuela and China and Russia. And those are the nations. Now, Syria comes into play, but that's a little bit of a different, I want to get into that one here in a second. But let's just think about this. The nations that said, we no longer want to use the U.S. dollar to buy and sell oil. China, Russia, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela. So it's pretty clear what's happening when you see this list. I mean, it just smacks you in the face what's happening here. There are no other countries that I know of. Maybe there are some more, and you can comment down below or send me an email. Go to my website, KimIverson.com, and tell me about, I could be wrong, tell me some other nations that maybe decide that they were going to drop using the U.S. dollar to buy and sell oil. But this is a pretty alarming list, especially when you think about the nations that we're considering to be our enemy or nations that we want to topple. We did topple Iraq and Libya. Look what we did to them. Iraq in 2000 said that they were no longer going to be using the U.S. dollar. And look what happened to them. That was in 2000. 2000, Iraq says, we're not going to use the U.S. dollar. After 9/11, the country that we decide to march into is Iraq because we said that they had weapons of mass destruction. Why were we not going after Saudi Arabia when 9/11 was largely done by Saudis? What happened there? So we go into Iraq, we say they've got weapons of mass destruction, and coincidentally, it was shortly after Iraq saying that they were going to drop the U.S. dollar to buy and sell oil. That's coincidental. Why weren't we marching into Saudi Arabia considering they were the ones who funneled the terrorists into our country to attack us? What's that about? And now we're claiming human rights abuses in Syria and Venezuela. And that's why we've got to go after Venezuela and Syria. And meanwhile, Saudi Arabia took a man and used a bone saw to hack him into pieces. And yet that's not a human rights violation? Because I don't remember a story of Maduro doing that. Do you? I don't have any stories of that. When I look up what human rights abuses Maduro has committed, I can't find anything. I really can't. And I've looked. What I found a ridiculous article from the Washington Post saying that a human rights abuse was they had detained a woman for days. But why did they detain the woman for days? They said, oh, they've detained this woman for days and they won't let her leave the country. She was being accused of trying to assassinate Maduro. So believe me, if somebody came into the United States, attempted to assassinate our president, I absolutely guarantee you that we would detain them and not let them leave the country. That is not a human rights abuse. They're saying, oh, other human rights abuses, the people are starving. Well, the people are starving because the nation's economy has tanked. Why is the nation's economy tanked? Because we basically said, if I can't have you, nobody else can. That's what we said to Venezuela about their oil. We said, oh, I see. You think that you're going to nationalize your oil and that you're going to make sure that those profits go to the people of Venezuela rather than to some rich capitalists. Okay, well, no, if we can't have it, then no one can. And we made sure that they were unable to sell it, that they were unable to profit off of that oil. We just said, okay, if you're not going to let these private companies come in and profit off of that oil reserve, then no one's going to profit off of it. Not you, not the people, nobody. And we bankrupted that country. We made sure that they had hyperinflation by flooding their market with really cheap oil. We did so many things. And yet, of course, the people are starving. Their economy has tanked. We had a population that starved at one point. It was during the Great Depression. So human rights abuse, apparently. So Iraq in 2000 announced that they would no longer use the U.S. dollar to sell oil in the global market. In Libya, Gaddafi, he proposed that he wanted to create a unified African currency backed by gold, which would have been used to buy and sell African oil. And look at what happened to Gaddafi. In 2017, Venezuela announced that it would free itself from the dollar. And look at what we're doing down in Venezuela. We're trying to fearmonger and spread propaganda about Maduro in order to topple the guy and put in a guy who is going to privatize the oil market in Venezuela and keep the oil backed by the U.S. dollar. So Iran has been using alternative currencies like the Chinese yen for some time now. China and Russia, they have been buying large swaths of gold, trying to get themselves prepared for potentially switching to a currency that is going to be backed by gold in order to buy and sell oil. So when you look at the nations who have announced that they're going to be dropping the U.S. dollar, we see a very strong common denominator there. And, and here we are, we're saying that Iran, we're going to drop the nuclear deal with Iran and potentially demonize them and potentially go after them. We're doing this in Venezuela. We're demonizing them and we're going to go after them. We did it in Libya. We did it in Iraq. China and Russia, we've just turned them into the enemy over and over again. China, Russia. We're going after them. We can't really go after them and topple them because they're nuclear world powers. So we don't have the same ability to go in and do to them what we did in Libya and Iraq and what we're doing in Venezuela and what we will surely try to do in Iran. So Syria, what is interesting about Syria is that Syria and Iran have a mutual deal. They're buddies. They help each other out quite a bit. But Syria has to do with a gas pipeline. Basically, there were two competing pipelines that were proposed, and both of them need to go through Syria. One of them was from Iran through Iraq into Syria, and the other one was from Saudi Arabia. It would go through Saudi Arabia and through Syria and into Lebanon. And these pipelines were meant to get gas to Europe. Russia has the big market of gas into Europe. They pretty much control that market, and they're dependent on that market. And so the Syrian civil war, when you look at it, it's actually not really about human rights abuses or Assad or any of these other things. You can actually line up who's for who based on who was for which pipeline. So the first pipeline was Iran. Russia was backing it. Syria, they're all together. The second pipeline was going to go through Turkey. So it was like Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. defends and backs. And then it was going to go through Lebanon and into Turkey. And, so you can see here the two sides. And obviously we have not been successful in Syria trying to topple Assad in order to get that gas pipeline going. And, so it's kind of one of those things that, I connect the dots, guys. I mean, this is just scary stuff. Anybody who says, oh, no, it's all these human rights abuses, really? Because once again, what about Saudi Arabia? They took a bone saw and hacked a guy up to pieces. And where's the screaming there? They stone women to death. Where's the screaming there? They didn't even let women drive up until just recently. Where's the screaming there? This is where Bernie Sanders is right. What he said in the town hall, he says, why are we complaining about the human rights abuses of one country, which may or may not be true for sure. Yes, there could be. There's many, war is ugly. War is ugly. In Syria, sure, maybe Assad did a lot of bad things because war is ugly. No matter how you slice it, it's ugly. Both sides do bad things. The Vietnam War, you know how many bad things American troops did? A lot. Because war is ugly. You can't just point at people and say, well, you're the bad guy because you did human rights abuses. Everybody does human rights abuses in war. I'm not excusing it by any means, but that's the reality of it. So why are we not screaming at Saudi Arabia for their obvious human rights abuses? Well, it's because they get a pass. They get a pass because they're the ones controlling the oil market. They're controlling the fact that it's being used, that the U.S. dollar is the required currency. And because of it, Saudi Arabia gets away with hacksawing a guy up into pieces and blowing up the World Trade Center. They get a pass for this stuff. That goes to show how important this petrodollar is. And we will get into that in a future show. What are the implications of that petrodollar crashing? If the U.S. dollar is no longer propped up by it, what happens? because it could be devastating for this country. So devastating that they're willing to kill. They're willing to kill, and they're willing to turn a blind eye to other murders in order to protect it. So what is up with that? And we're going to talk about that sometime in the near future. Okay, I need to move on with the show here. Coming up, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act bill was downvoted in the Senate. They said no to this. It's now caused outrage amongst the conservatives. The right-wingers are going crazy. We can absolutely we can assure that this is going to be an election fight in 2020. We're going to talk about that. That is coming up next. Hit this. Now's the time.